When the doctors finally let me leave the hospital, my children came to pick me up. They walked into the room with wide smiles on their faces, carrying a bright bouquet of pink carnations. My daughter hugged me tightly, whispering that it was a miracle I survived. My son kissed my forehead, telling me how lucky we all were that the old sedan had absorbed the brunt of the impact. They kept repeating the word lucky over and over again, like a mantra meant to erase the bruises on my arms and the deep ache in my chest. I looked at them, my voice barely a whisper, and asked the only question that mattered to me. I asked if anyone had checked the back seat of the car after the tow truck arrived. I asked if anyone had gone down to the ravine by the old county road to look for the small, wicker travel basket. The smiles on their faces faded instantly, replaced by a look of polite discomfort. My daughter looked down at her shoes, and my son cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his shirt. It was in that exact moment of silence that the true weight of the accident settled over me. The crash had taken my old car, crumpling the metal like paper, but that did not matter to me. A car can be replaced by an insurance check, and a dented bumper can be forgotten. What the crash really did was steal my only companion, the one creature who kept the silence of my quiet house away. They did not understand that to them, it was just an animal, a pet that had gone missing in the chaos of a highway accident. To me, that little cat was the thread holding my daily life together after my husband passed away. I did not scream at them, and I did not cry out in anger. I simply turned my head toward the hospital window, watching the gray rain slide down the glass pane. My children meant well, and they loved me in their own busy, modern way. But they could not feel the sudden, terrifying emptiness that was waiting for me back at the house. They saw a mother who had survived a terrible ordeal, while I saw a lonely old woman who had just lost her best friend. As we walked out into the chilly afternoon air, the world felt incredibly loud and moving far too fast. The traffic on the street sounded like a roar, and the faces of strangers seemed like a blur. I allowed my son to guide me into the passenger seat of his clean, modern SUV, but my mind was still stuck on that dark stretch of road near the woods. I knew that somewhere out there, terrified and alone in the cold, a small black and white cat was waiting for the sound of my footsteps. And the thought of him out there by himself hurt far more than any injury the accident had given me. To understand why a small cat meant so much to me, you have to understand what my life looked like before the accident. I live in a modest, white-painted house at the very end of a gravel lane, about 20 miles outside the city limits. It is the kind of house that used to be filled with noise, laughter, and the constant slamming of the screen door. My husband, Arthur, and I raised our 2 children there, spending our weekends fixing the porch, mowing the lawn, and cooking large Sunday dinners. For over 30 years, that house was the center of a very loud and vibrant universe. But time has a strange way of quietening things down without you even noticing it happen. First, the children grew up and went off to college in the city, their visits becoming shorter and further apart. Then, 5 years ago, Arthur went to sleep one night and simply never woke up. The morning after he died, the silence in that house was so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like an echo, and the kitchen felt far too large for just one person. I spent the first year of my widowhood wandering through the rooms, adjusting picture frames and making pots of coffee that I would end up pouring down the sink. My children called me every Tuesday evening, their voices hurried as they talked about their jobs, their meetings, and their busy weekends. They always asked if I was doing all right, and I always told them that I was fine, because I did not want to burden them with my loneliness. They had their own lives to build, and it was natural for them to move forward while I stayed behind. Then came a rainy Tuesday morning in November, about 3 years after Arthur passed away. I was sitting on the porch wrapped in a wool shawl, watching the mist rise from the fields, when I heard a faint, raspy sound near the steps. I looked down and saw a tiny, half-drenched kitten shivering beneath the bottom wooden plank. He was mostly black, with 4 white paws that looked like little socks, and a small white patch right under his chin. He was so thin that his ribs were showing, and his fur was matted with wet mud and burrs. I did not intend to keep him when I first brought him into the warm kitchen. I told myself I would just give him a saucer of milk, dry him off with an old towel, and find a neighbor who wanted a Mauser. But as I rubbed his damp fur, he began to purr so loudly that the small table seemed to vibrate. It was a deep, rumbling sound that filled the quiet corner of the room, breaking the heavy silence that had lived there for years. He looked up at me with wide, bright green eyes, completely unafraid, and curled himself into a ball right on my lap. I ended up naming him Barnaby because he had a serious, old-fashioned look about his face that reminded me of an old shopkeeper. From that day on, my routine changed completely, and the loneliness that had been my constant shadow began to lift. I no longer woke up to an empty house. I woke up to Barnaby sitting patiently at the foot of my bed, waiting for his morning meal. When I walked from the living room to the kitchen, he would follow closely behind, his long tail held straight up in the air like a little flagpole. We developed our own quiet language over those 2 years together. When I sat down to read the newspaper, he would rest his chin right on the edge of the pages, as if he were reading the articles along with me. When the winter wind howled through the old window frames, he would curl up behind my knees on the sofa, keeping me warmer than any electric blanket ever could. I found myself talking to him while I washed the dishes, telling him about my childhood, about Arthur, and about the things I missed. Barnaby never judged, never interrupted, and never seemed bored by my stories. He simply listened, blinking his green eyes with a slow, gentle understanding. My children thought it was sweet that I had a pet, though they often laughed about how much I spoiled him. When they visited during the holidays, they would buy him expensive cat toys that he never played with, preferring instead to play with the crumpled wrapping paper or a stray piece of yarn from my knitting basket. They saw him as an amusement, a hobby to keep their aging mother occupied so they wouldn't have to worry about her being entirely isolated. They did not see that Barnaby had become my family, filling the empty spaces that they had left behind when they moved away. Every evening before bed, I would sit in Arthur's old rocking chair by the wood stove, and Barnaby would jump up into my lap, purring until we both grew sleepy. He knew exactly when I was having a difficult day, when the memories of the past felt a little too heavy to bear. On those nights, he would press his head against my hand, letting me know in his own silent way that I was not completely alone in the world. He was my constant, steady little anchor in a life that had otherwise become very quiet and very still. The trouble began when my eyesight started to weaken a little, and my children began to worry about me living alone in the country. They started making subtle hints during their weekly phone calls, suggesting that perhaps the house was too big for me to manage. They talked about modern senior living communities closer to the city, places with manicured lawns, group activities, and medical staff on duty. Each time they brought it up, my stomach would tighten with a cold dread, and I would look down at Barnaby sleeping by my feet. "Mom, it's just not safe for you to be out there by yourself anymore," my son, David, told me during a Sunday visit. He was looking at the old roof, counting the shingles that needed replacement. "If something happens, it takes an ambulance 20 minutes just to get down the gravel road. You need to be closer to us." My daughter, Sarah, agreed with him, nodding as she cleared the teacups from the table. "And think about how much easier it would be, Mom. No more worrying about the wood stove or the winter snow. You could just relax and let someone else handle the chores." I tried to explain to them that the chores were what kept me moving, that the daily routine of looking after the house and caring for Barnaby gave me a purpose. I told them that I could not imagine living in a small, uniform apartment where I wasn't allowed to plant my own geraniums or sit on my own porch. But more than anything, I knew that most of those modern senior communities had strict rules about pets. Some allowed small dogs, but many did not accept animals at all, or charged fees that I could not afford on my small pension. When I mentioned this, David just waved his hand dismissively. "We can always find a nice home for Barnaby with one of our neighbors, Mom," David said, as if he were talking about an old piece of furniture we no longer needed. "He's an outdoor cat anyway, he'd adapt quickly to a new barn or a yard. Your health has to come first." His words felt like a sharp prick to my heart. Barnaby was not an outdoor cat, he was a sensitive creature who loved the warmth of the indoor rug and hated the sound of thunder. The thought of giving him away to strangers, of him wondering why the person who loved him had suddenly disappeared, made me feel physically ill. That afternoon, after my children drove away back to their fast-paced city lives, I held Barnaby close to my chest for a long time, whispering into his soft fur that I would never let anyone separate us. To prove to my children that I was still perfectly independent, I resolved to make the drive into the city for my quarterly medical checkup on my own. Usually, David or Sarah would offer to drive down and take me, but their schedules were always so tight, and I could hear the stress in their voices whenever they had to arrange the trip. I wanted to show them that I was still capable, that my old sedan was running perfectly fine, and that I did not need to be coddled or moved into a facility. The morning of the appointment was cold and overcast, with dark, heavy clouds hanging low over the autumn fields. I packed a small lunch, checked the locks on the doors, and prepared to leave. As I walked toward the front door, Barnaby did something he had never done before. Instead of sitting by the kitchen window to watch me leave, he ran ahead of me, slipped through my ankles, and stood right by the car door, letting out a sharp, persistent meow. I tried to shoo him back into the house, but he refused to budge, his green eyes fixed on mine with a strange, urgent intensity. When I picked him up to carry him back inside, he clung to my sweater with his little claws, purring frantically but refusing to let go. A strange feeling, a sudden wave of intuition, washed over me. I looked at the dark sky, then down at the little cat in my arms, and decided to bring him along with me. I had an old, wicker travel basket in the closet that Arthur had bought years ago, and I lined it with a soft flannel blanket. "All right, little one," I murmured, setting the basket gently onto the back seat of the sedan. "You can come with me today. We will make a little adventure out of it." Barnaby settled into the basket immediately, turning around 3 times before curling into a tight circle. He didn't make a sound as I started the engine and began the slow drive down the gravel lane. The road was quiet, the trees shedding their final amber leaves into the chilly wind. For the first 10 miles, the drive was peaceful, with the old radio playing soft big band music from my youth and the steady hum of the tires against the asphalt providing a comforting rhythm. But as we turned onto the state highway, the weather began to change rapidly. The light drizzle turned into a heavy, blinding downpour, the kind of rain that makes the entire world look gray and liquid. The windshield wipers could barely keep up with the sheets of water hitting the glass, and the visibility dropped to just a few feet in front of the hood. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white as I slowed the car down, trying to stay close to the white line on the shoulder. From the back seat, I heard Barnaby let out a soft, questioning meow. He could feel the tension in the car, the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "It's all right, Barnaby," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and calm so he wouldn't panic. "We are almost past the ridge. Just a few more miles, and the road will widen up." But even as I spoke the words, a deep sense of unease settled in my stomach, a feeling that I should have listened to the quiet warnings of the morning. The accident happened in a fraction of a second, yet in my memory, it plays out in agonizingly slow motion. We were descending the steep, winding hill near the Old Creek Bridge, where the road curves sharply to the left. The asphalt there is always slick, covered in a treacherous layer of wet, fallen leaves that never truly dry out during the autumn months. As I tapped the brakes to guide the sedan around the bend, I felt the steering wheel go completely loose in my hands. The tires lost their grip on the road, and the car began to slide helplessly across the center line. Through the blurred windshield, I saw a pair of bright, terrifying headlights coming directly toward me from the opposite direction, a massive commercial delivery truck. The driver of the truck blew his horn, a loud, deafening blast that echoed through the valley, as he tried to swerve out of my way. I instinctively pulled the steering wheel hard to the right, trying to steer away from the oncoming collision, but the momentum carried my old sedan off the edge of the pavement. The car hit the muddy shoulder, skidded sideways, and then plunged down the steep, rocky embankment toward the ravine below. I remember the terrible, grinding sound of metal scraping against rocks, the shattering of the side windows, and the violent jolting of my body against the seatbelt. In the midst of that terrifying chaos, above the roar of the rushing air and the tearing of iron, I heard one single, sharp cry of terror from the back seat. It was Barnaby, his basket being thrown across the cabin as the car finally came to a violent, crushing halt against the trunk of a large oak tree. For several minutes, there was nothing but a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the hiss of steam rising from the destroyed radiator and the steady, rhythmic dripping of rainwater onto the crumpled hood. I was trapped against the steering wheel, my breath caught in my throat, a sharp pain radiating through my shoulder and ribs. The world was spinning, and a thin trickle of warmth was running down the side of my face from a cut on my forehead. I couldn't move my legs, but my mind was completely clear about one thing. "Barnaby," I choked out, my voice thick with dust and pain. Barnaby, where are you? I forced my head around, ignoring the sharp ache in my neck, to look into the darkened back seat. The rear window had been completely blown out during the impact, leaving nothing but a jagged frame of broken glass open to the cold woods. The wicker travel basket was lying on its side on the floorboards, its small wire door popped completely off its hinges. The soft flannel blanket was empty. There was no sign of the little black and white cat anywhere inside the ruined vehicle. Outside, the rain continued to pour down, soaking through the broken windows and chilling the air inside the car within minutes. I called his name again and again, my voice growing weaker as the shock began to take hold of my body. I strained my ears, desperately listening for a meow, a scratch, or any sign of life from the thick brush outside. But the only sound was the wind howling through the trees and the distant, muffled shouting of people up on the highway above. It felt like hours before the emergency responders descended the muddy slope with their heavy equipment and bright flashing lights. They were professional, efficient, and gentle as they worked to cut through the crushed door to free me from the wreckage. They kept telling me to remain still, to hold their hands, and that everything was going to be all right. But every time they asked me where it hurt, I could only point toward the broken rear window. My cat. I whispered to the young paramedic who was placing a neck brace on me. He was in the back. He's out there in the woods. Please, you have to look for him. The paramedic gave me a look of deep pity, the kind of look people give to someone who is confused or losing their grip on reality. Ma'am, we need to get you up to the ambulance right now, he said softly, his hand steady as he lifted me onto the stretcher. The storm is getting worse, and we need to check you for internal injuries. Don't worry about anything else right now. Just focus on breathing. As they carried me up the steep, slippery embankment on the stretcher, I looked down at the dark ravine one last time. The crumpled white sedan looked incredibly small against the massive oak tree, a broken toy abandoned in the wilderness. The rain was washing away the tire tracks, covering the scene in a blanket of gray mud. I closed my eyes as they slid me into the back of the warm, brightly lit ambulance, the sound of the siren drowning out the quiet, desperate prayers I was whispering for my lost companion. The 3 days I spent in the hospital were a blur of sterile white ceilings, periodic blood pressure checks, and the soft hum of medical monitors. My injuries were fortunately minor, a fractured collarbone, a few deep bruises, and a concussion that left me feeling dizzy whenever I tried to sit up. My children stayed by my side during the visiting hours, bringing me magazines I didn't read and food I couldn't bring myself to eat. They spoke in loud, cheerful voices about how wonderfully the doctors were treating me and how quickly my bruises were fading. But whenever the room grew quiet, my mind would instantly drift back to the ravine. Every time the wind rattled the heavy glass of the hospital window, I would think of Barnaby out there in the freezing rain, hungry, injured, and terrified. I begged David to drive down to the crash site to look for him, to call his name along the tree line, or to leave a bowl of food near the wreckage. David would always nod patiently, patting my hand with a gentle, patronizing smile. I looked around when I went to get your personal items from the impound lot, Mom, David lied, his voice smooth but lacking any real warmth. There was no sign of him. An animal like that, well, when a car crashes, they usually run off into the woods and find their own way. He's probably back to being a wild cat now. You need to focus on your recovery. Sarah tried to comfort me by suggesting that we could go to the shelter and find a new, older cat once I was settled into a new apartment. It will be nice, Mom, she said cheerfully, adjusting my pillows. A fresh start. A clean slate. You won't have to worry about the past anymore. Their words showed me exactly how vast the distance was between my world and theirs. They thought a companion was something interchangeable, a commodity that could be replaced with a trip to a store or a shelter. They didn't understand that Barnaby wasn't just a cat, he was the specific soul that had shared my grief, the one who knew the exact cadence of my voice and the silence of my home. Their lack of understanding hurt more than the fractured bone in my shoulder, causing me to close my eyes and pretend to sleep just to escape their well-meaning conversations. The day I was discharged, they drove me back to my house in the country to help me pack a few things. They had decided, without my consent, that I would stay at Sarah's house in the city for a few weeks while we looked for an assisted living facility. As the SUV turned down my gravel lane, the house looked smaller, older, and incredibly lonely against the gray afternoon sky. The porch where Barnaby used to sit was empty, wet leaves cluttering the steps where he used to wait for me. The moment Sarah unlocked the front door, the silence of the house rushed out to meet us like a cold draft. There was no scampering of paws across the linoleum, no soft, welcoming meow from the kitchen rug. His food bowl was still sitting by the refrigerator, half filled with dry kibble that had grown stale over the 3 days I was gone. A small mouse toy lay abandoned near the sofa, its felt ears chewed down from hours of play. While my children busied themselves packing a suitcase with my clothes and medications, I sat down in Arthur's old rocking chair. The house felt like a tomb, a museum of a life that had suddenly been stripped of its warmth. I realized then that my children were right about one thing: I couldn't live here like this anymore. But it wasn't because of my physical health or the danger of the country road. It was because without Barnaby, the house was no longer a home. It was just an empty box filled with old memories and loud, echoing silence. I looked at the window, watching the sun begin to dip below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the living room rug. I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of defeat, a feeling that my independent life had officially come to an end in that muddy ravine 3 days ago. I allowed Sarah to wrap my coat around my shoulders and guide me back out toward the car, my head bowed as I prepared to leave the key under the mat for the final time, leaving my past behind me in the dark. Just as David was about to close the passenger door of the SUV, a strange sound broke through the quiet rustle of the autumn wind. It was faint, incredibly distant, and carried a raspy, breathless quality that made my heart stop in my chest. It sounded like a high-pitched cry, coming from the very edge of the woods where the gravel lane meets the main road, almost 2 miles away from where the accident had actually occurred. I pushed David's hand away from the door, my movement sudden and sharp despite the pain in my shoulder. I stepped out onto the damp gravel, my breath rising in small white plumes in the chilly air, and listened with an intensity one didn't know I possessed. "Mom, what are you doing?" Sarah called out from the driver's seat, her voice tinged with annoyance and worry. "It's freezing out here, we need to get on the highway before rush hour starts." "Be quiet," I commanded, my voice carrying a strength that shocked both of them into instant silence. There it was again. A tiny, unmistakable meow, closer this time, coming from the dense thicket of briars near the drainage ditch. The bushes began to rustle violently, and out crawled a small, limping figure. It was covered from head to toe in thick, black mud, its fur matted with dried blood and burrs, and its left rear leg was held gingerly off the ground. But under the layer of filth, I could see the small white patch under its chin and those wide, bright green eyes looking straight at me. Barnaby had walked for 3 days through the freezing rain and briars, dragging his injured leg across miles of unfamiliar territory, just to find his way back to the only place he knew, the white house at the end of the lane where the old woman loved him. He had not run off to become a wild animal, he had fought his way home through the dark, driven by the same silent bond that had kept me company through my darkest years of grief. I didn't care about the mud or the blood. I fell to my knees on the wet gravel road, catching him in my arms as he made one final, desperate leap into my lap. He buried his head into the crook of my elbow, his entire small body shaking with exhaustion and cold, but his purr began instantly, a deep, frantic, rumbling sound that seemed to drown out the entire world. I held him tightly against my chest, my tears finally flowing freely, washing clean patches into the dried mud on his coat. My children stood completely frozen on the driveway, watching the scene in absolute silence. For the first time, I saw a look of true understanding flash across David's face, followed by a deep, quiet flush of shame. He looked at the little cat, then at his mother crying on the gravel, and he finally understood that some relationships cannot be measured by logic, safety, or convenience. They realized that this small creature was the very soul of my home, a piece of my life that could never be replaced or discarded. David walked over slowly, kneeling down into the mud beside me without a single thought for his expensive trousers. He gently extended his hand, letting Barnaby sniff his fingers, before placing a warm, protective palm over the cat's shivering back. "Let's get him inside, Mom," David said softly, his voice thick with an emotion I hadn't heard in years. "Sarah, turn the heater on in the house. We need to warm up some water and call the local vet right away." We didn't go to the city that evening, and we never looked at another senior living community again. David and Sarah stayed at the house for the entire weekend, helping me clean Barnaby's fur, building a warm bed for him near the wood stove, and fixing the latch on the front screen door. They saw that as long as that little black and white cat was sitting by my feet, I was never truly alone, and I had all the strength I needed to keep taking care of my home. Now, as I sit in Arthur's old rocking chair with Barnaby sleeping soundly in my lap, his leg completely healed and his fur as glossy as silk, I look out at the quiet country road. The accident took my car, and it left me with a few scars that ache when the weather turns cold. But it also taught my family a lesson about love, loyalty, and what truly makes a home. It showed us that the smallest companions often possess the largest hearts, and that a silent promise made between two lonely souls is something that even the most violent crash can never truly destroy.